Hello, everybody. Um, Welcome back. We're going to delve into two topics from Unit 9, 9.6, 9.7, which are ocean warming and ocean acidification. All right. The enduring understanding, of course, is that local and regional human activities can actually impact things at the global level. All right. So, first of all, we got to remember that the warming that we're seeing at the Earth's surface includes both land and ocean. The data set we've been looking at in class, in fact, was a combined data set of both land and ocean. But if we do look at the impacts on each separately, we'll notice that the temperature for land has been increasing a little bit faster than temperature of the ocean. And that makes perfect sense based on what we've learned previously this year with specific heat, right? Uh, the rate at which large bodies of water heat up and cool off is slower than the rate at which land does, and that's because water has a higher specific heat. All right. Now, so the ocean's warming. We're going to focus in now, though, on what sorts of impacts might the warming ocean have on ecosystems and marine species. All right, so there's a variety of things that can happen. One of them is major impacts on certain habitats, most particularly coral reefs, and we'll talk about what's going on with coral reefs here in a little bit. But also, um, the change in temperature of the ocean. So some fish species are particularly sensitive to ocean water temperatures, and sometimes even their reproductive cycles or metabolic rates and respiration rates are highly dependent on water being a certain temperature. And when those temperatures change, it can add stress to many of those marine species. All right, so let's delve in a little bit more into what I just mentioned before, which is coral bleaching. So coral is actually a symbiont organism. So coral is like an animal, a tiny little organism that creates shells from ions in the ocean, much like we talked about way back in our carbon cycle unit. All right, so they're a shell-forming animal, but they have a mutualistic relationship with various types of algae. And so the color you're seeing in this picture, not the fish, but the color of the various corals, that color is actually provided by the various species of algae that have that mutualistic relationship with those corals. Okay. Now, if you guys also recall, back in our biodiversity unit, we talked about coral reefs being sort of like the tropical rainforest of the ocean, right? Coral reefs are our most productive ecosystem. Somewhere near to 25% of all marine species at least have some of their life cycle supported by coral reef habitats. Okay, so super, super important ocean habitat is coral reefs. Now, coral bleaching occurs when the coral expel their mutualistic algae, right? And that happens when the coral is under distress. And the distress in this case that we're seeing globally in our coral reefs is from primarily from rising ocean temperatures. So the distressed coral from warming the water expels the algae symbiont, right? Changing that coral reef habitat altogether. So um, basically getting rid of that color, you're left with essentially the gray or white shell. All right, that's why they call it coral bleaching, by the way. All right, now that entirely changes the structure of that ecosystem. Many of the fish species, right, that live have at least some of their protection from predators by being brightly colored, much like their coral reef habitat, right? And so the bleaching of that coral reef habitat often results in the majority of the fish species and other marine species evacuating that area altogether. So a major habitat loss. All right. It's estimated that between 70 and 90% of all coral reefs will either be in severe decline or already dead within the next several decades. Really, really scary and sad. All right. Now, some other impacts of warming water. We've talked about this before too, but warmer water is less able to hold on to dissolved gases like dissolved oxygen. So when I mentioned before, respiration of fish, for example, can become distressed in warmer waters. That's partly because the amount of dissolved oxygen available to fish decreases as temperature increases. All right. Now, the other thing we want to talk about, also related to the current phenomena of climate change is ocean acidification. Now, we've talked about this back on our carbon cycle unit a little bit, right? So, the relationship we want to make sure we're understanding here is that as atmospheric carbon dioxide increases over time, right? So, if this is our ocean, we got CO2 in the air, and then some of that dissolves, we call that dissolution, into the ocean. Now, if we increase CO2 in the atmosphere, we're also going to increase the amount that gets dissolved into our ocean water. So we can look at this emerging from this graph. Here's our atmospheric CO2, right? The green line is the amount of CO2 in the ocean. And we can see if we did a line of best fit through that, it would basically follow the essentially the same slope as the atmospheric CO2. There's an equilibrium constant that kicks in there. All right. Now, the reason we're a little bit concerned about increased CO2 in the ocean is the impact that it's having on the pH, right? So just remember, if we have a lower pH, that means more acidic. All right. So the blue line, if we do a line of best fit through that blue, we can see a gradual decrease in the pH of the ocean. As CO2 increases, more CO2 dissolves into the ocean. That causes a decrease in the pH or causing the ocean to become more acidic. Now, not a lot more acidic, and notice that the pH is still above neutral, which makes it slightly alkaline. But as that pH drops, it's moving that more toward the acidic side. Now, why is that a concern? So, first of all, let's understand the mechanism that's happening. So, we have CO2 production, right, from burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, all those things we've talked about before. All right, CO2 is going to get brought into forests just like before through photosynthesis, right? But the ocean is going to uptake a lot of that CO2. And it's a really important, what they call carbon sink, right? Lots of carbon is going into the ocean. Much of the carbon we emit into the atmosphere actually goes into the ocean. Okay? Now, as that carbon dioxide dissolves, it can react with water to form carbonic acid. Okay? That carbonic acid formation, right, releases hydrogen ions, and that's what causes pH to decrease over time. Okay? Now, with a small drop in pH, right, one of the things that happens is, again, this is not a matter of increasing how corrosive oceans are with that much of a change in pH. It's really not so much about that, is that it does impact the formation of certain ions, right, that organisms need in order to form their shells. So basically, right, carbonates are more soluble, are more soluble at lower pH, right? So basically, for a shell to form, we have to have a mechanism to precipitate ions out of seawater to form a solid, right? But the more soluble an ion is, the harder it is to get that ion to precipitate out to form a solid. So as that pH lowers even slightly, right, we're adjusting the solubility of carbonates. Carbonates are what are needed in order to form shells. All right. If the carbonates are more soluble, it is more difficult for those shell forming organisms to actually form those shells in the first place. All right. That takes us to the end of topics 9.6 and 9.7.